Okay, we're finally getting around to doing the first of the aesthetic concept, contrast, which of course is something that creates conflict and put competition on the sketch itself that makes it interesting. Let's go. Alright, so we have covered the 7 aesthetic concepts: contrast, dominance, balance, alternation, gradation, unity, movement, at a very high level. Today, we're going to go into the idea of creating contrast in your sketch. And what we're going to do is show you in a practical way how you can create contrast using the ingredients of urban sketching. Of course, when you create those conflicts and put competition of the elements or the ingredients into your sketch, it makes it much more interesting. So a very quick recap of what the ingredients, they are: form, space, lines, shape, texture, color, and value. Those 7 things, we will try to explain how you can use those 7 ingredients to create contrast in your sketch. Okay, let's start with the concept of space. How do you create contrast in, sketching of space? So for example, if you're sketching a bunch of figures all lined up in a straight line, same distance from where you stand as a sketcher and where you are observing them. So they may look something like this. All the 4 figures here are equidistant from where you're observing them, and there is no differentiation in the space. There's nothing wrong in this sketch per se, but then you're not creating contrast in the ingredient of space, which you could do. For example, if you pull one of the figures nearer to you, clearly will be in much bigger shape in terms of the figure, and that is what contrast is about. You're creating the contrast of space. So as you can see in this sketch, the figures are now not in equidistance but in different space from where you're observing them. The figure on the left clearly is much bigger, much closer. The lady standing way at the back clearly is much further and is much smaller in size. There's a few reasons that you want to do this. One, it creates contrast in space. The other is that, well, the big figure takes away a whole bunch of space in your sketch, and therefore reduce the amount of work that you have to do. Just a joke. And of course, it's also much more interesting than if you just line them up and sketch them all in the same size and distance. Alright, the second ingredient that you can use is lines. And clearly when you use lines, you can have very straight lines and then you can curve it, and that provides certain contrast. So if you look at this sketch, you can find straight versus curve being the main idea. Not necessarily the most impressive sketch, but the whole idea of just having the contrast makes it more interesting than otherwise. The next idea of line contrast is you can have a very energetic, against a less energetic line. So this sketch demonstrates you can pit lazy line against energetic line, and against that's also one of the contrasts. There are actually many ways to do contrast with lines, but I've just shown you a couple. One more example, perhaps. You can have a very deliberate line drawn against more tentative lines on top, or otherwise more sketchy line, as your approach to the sketch itself. So you see this temple is drawn with very sketchy line, almost texturing. Shape, as you know, is very, very important. So you could also contrast shape. So for example, if you have a whole bunch of square or rectangle, and then suddenly there's sort of a egg oval or like round circle type shape, it also is a way of contrasting the sketch. For example, in this sketch, you'll find a whole bunch of rectangles at the back, and then there's figures which are oval or organic. So that provides some element of contrast and interest. Of course, it's also a little bit of a conflict and competition, but you get the idea. It provides something to make it more interesting. Another idea is to have the geometric versus organic. Geometrics are all these circle, rectangle, triangular, and then against an organic, like a shape of a leaf, for example, you can use that as a contrasting element. So as you can see, the house provide the geometric lines and shapes, but the trees, the banana trees, the coconut trees provide the organic shapes to make it contrasting, and in some way it makes the sketch workable. Okay, the next ingredient is form. And how do you create contrast of form? Well, if you look at this, it's three-dimensional against a two-dimensional flat surface, and by doing so you create the contrast of 3D against 2D. So let me give you two examples. The first example is where I have a sketch of a statue of Ganesha, and then at the back I flatten the design concept, which is just a bunch of texturing of colors, and it's flat 2D. So 3D against 2D, if you like. And here, this example is where I have a three-dimensional bananas against a very flat surface on the ground of two-dimensional shadows. And again, that provide the contrast of 3D against 2D. Personally, I find this one of the hardest to do, but it's something to keep in mind when you're trying to create contrast and all you have is a three-dimensional object. Just remember, make it 3D against 2D, it might just work better. The next ingredient is colors. You can use colors to create contrast, and one of the simplest is to put yellow purple. Where you put yellow, you put purple. Where you put purple, you put yellow. And that just gonna create a very strong contrast. This is my personal favorite, as you know. Christmas comes early. Well, you can have green against red as well as one of the contrasts as well. Where you put red, just have a dot of green next to it. When you have lots of green, just have a little bit of red maybe next to it, and it will just make it pop in some ways. You will see the contrast is very, very strong here, especially red being one of the strongest color you can put on your sketchbook. If you study the color view, you know that there are three sets of complementary based on the three primary colors of red, yellow, and blue. The third one obviously would be blue-orange. Not quite orangey, but you get the idea. It's still blue against somewhat of a brown-orange mix, and it will still work. Besides complementary color, the other idea is to have bright against dull. So in this case, you can see red against the dull background color, and that is also one way of contrasting color. Another idea about color is color in light, or color in the sunlight, or color in the shadow, and they are completely different, and they are one way of contrasting the colors. The next contrast you can play with is value. Values at say 5, which is the darkest, and 1, which is the lightest. You can have 1 next to 5, or maybe 3 next to 5. This sketch, of course, is primarily play out with value sketch, and so you can see the contrast where 1 is next to 5 and where 1 is next to 4 or 3, and so on and so forth. Contrast doesn't have to be extreme. It doesn't have to be always 1 against 5. I mean, you just got to think about what you're trying to do, but providing contrast is very, very important. Remember, value needs to be right. Color doesn't have to be, because color does get all the glory, but actually value does all the work. So you can see in this sketch of the elephant, the colors are crazy, but the values are quite on point, so therefore the sketch will work. But in this case, I'm just contrasting the values of light against dark and playing with that with different colors. I also like the concept of light against dark, dark against light, playing with the value of in other words, opposites, if you like. You can see the kettle on the left is dark against light, and the kettle and the teapot or cup on the right is light against dark. I love hunting for this sort of value play, especially when you can see in this sketch, this part of the figure is light against dark, well, clearly, and here is dark against light. And if I put them in the same sketch, it makes it very, very interesting. So this is the play of light against dark, dark against light. In essence, it's a value scheme. Okay, the next idea is texturing. We're gonna pit bold and strong lines and shape against fuzzy and soft, basically lines that are not well defined. let me show you a sketch where I try to use this as a way of contrasting the solid silver armored guy in front versus a bunch of the crowd in soft, fuzzy, not well defined texture, if you like. But the whole idea is to contrast, and of course that creates depth and so on, but the whole idea is the contrast of solid versus fuzzy texture play. You can go crazy with texture. I mean, you can have very well defined texture, like for example, if I were just to cross hatch this, just hatch this for example, and let me clean this up with a small solid line, use a thicker line, and let me just draw them and erase some of the edges. So this is a very solid sort of hatch scheme, if you like. And then let's put another rectangle, and then let's just put some stuff on it and see how it might, I don't know, I'm just playing with Procreate and the various sort of texturing tools that I can find, and that might just give me the kind of contrast, and you can see the contrast gives you interest, if you like, and you put them side by side, they are different design, if you like. Okay, that's just illustration, but let me give you an example. In this case, you can see the statue is very plain. In fact, it is lightly sketched to make it three-dimensional, and then I purposely texture the background with bold darks and colorful splotch of cadmium yellow, cadmium orange, and all kinds of RYB, red, yellow, and blue stuff thrown in the background. So it's basically texturing, and that in some ways create the contrast and therefore the interest for the sketch. So there you have it. In summary, how do you create contrast, conflict, competition using the ingredients of urban sketching? All the 7 ingredients I demonstrated to some extent using my own sketches. I hope it gives you some ideas that you can play with, so when you're stuck in a sketch and how to create a more interesting sketch, you remember contrast, contrast, contrast. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay safe wherever you are. This is Whee Teck, out.